we're going to get started. Sorry, you guys are stuck with me again. All right, so I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Edward Altman, who is the Max L. Heine Professor of Finance Emeritus at NYU Stern School of Business. Since joining NYU in 1967, Dr. Altman has been a leading figure in academic finance, with research focused largely in the fields of corporate restructuring and bankruptcy. Dr. Altman is particularly well known for the creation of the Altman Z-Score, first published in 1968, which has been widely used since then to analyze corporate health and predict failure. Dr. Altman has written and edited an astounding 24 books in the areas of finance, accounting, and economics, and has consulted or lectured for executives and officials in North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia, every continent except Antarctica. Here's Professor Altman, hot off the heels of conferences in China and South Korea just last week to tell us about the Altman Z-Score and its influence over the past half-century.
Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to, you can probably hear me pretty well. Maybe good. Is it any better now? Okay, great. Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you, Yale, for organizing this conference. I wish when I was an undergraduate student, I had the chance to attend a conference like this. Because I had no idea what research was all about at that point until maybe I was a junior or senior. I went to City College of New York and then UCLA for my graduate work. And I noticed that a few schools like Yale and Princeton and maybe a few others are doing programs like this. I think it's terrific. And when I had the chance to come and speak here, I was very honored to be asked, and I think you all have a great perspective on your lives to spend time and come here to Yale and participate in this type of setting. I was very interested in the prior talk, which I'll perhaps have some comments as I go through this as well, because I've personally been involved in investigative journalism, not from me doing it, but from being interviewed by investigative journalists about doing stories on various things. The title, as you can see, deals with a 50-year retrospective on some of my research, but actually, I don't know if I'm happy or not to say it's actually closer to 60 years now. I've been a professor at NYU now for 58 years. I haven't figured out a way to get another job, so I'm still there. I did my original research in the area of bankruptcy prediction when I was a graduate student. Now it's almost 60 years that it's been out. I was 7 when I wrote the paper. No, just kidding. I've been around a long time. I've seen a lot in terms of credit markets, credit cycles, bankruptcies, reorganizations, restructuring. And to give you an idea of how important this topic is, at least everyone who thinks their research is very important. So you have to understand there's always a bias when someone speaks about their own research. But to give you an idea how important it could be, especially for people like you, even though you may not think so, we introduced at NYU undergraduate Stern a new club for students to enter. It's called SSIG, Special Situations Investment Group. And basically it's for investments, whether you're a professional or individual, in companies that are having distress. In fact, there is an area called distressed investing now that is growing dramatically in terms of assets under management, financial institutions specializing in buying or going short, in other words, betting that stocks will go down, companies, stocks or bonds that are in trouble. And I had the privilege and good fortune to be involved in the evolution of many of topics dealing with financial distress, particularly at the corporate level. There's a distress, of course, for individuals, for countries, different markets, mortgage markets, stock markets, bond markets. But I'm concentrating in my research on mainly non-financial corporations, the main type of companies that are out there. So this talk is going to be a kind of a retrospective on how we built the original models, how we did our research almost 60 years ago, and how things have changed in terms of research over this period of time. But also, what have we learned about bankruptcy, distress over these 50, 60 years, and what is the current state of the art with respect to that topic. Now, normally, this subject and the PowerPoint that I'm going to use, I would need about 4 hours. Thank you very much, Richard. He told me I can go until midnight, so thank you very much for all of you to hang around then. But I understand there's a lunch waiting for you, and then a poster session afterwards, which I'm sure you're all very excited about too. So I'll try to do it in the allotted time that we have and answer questions now or during lunch. Don't hesitate to come over and chat about maybe some aspect of what I'm talking about that you didn't get a chance to ask a question when we were in a formal session. The first part of my talk, I'm going to skip over very quickly, has to do with scoring systems. Now, whether you realize it or not, all of you will be or are involved in scoring systems. And that is when you or your parents or your relatives go to a bank or a credit union and ask for a loan with respect to buying an automobile or buying a house or a refrigerator, you will be scored. And you or your parents will be scored in terms of the credit worthiness that you have with respect to repaying the debt that you're trying to take on. And that's a traditional type of use for scoring systems. When I was a graduate student at UCLA in the early and mid 1960s, believe it or not, I know not only were you not born then, but maybe your parents weren't even born then, some of you, things were perhaps more primitive, but there were scoring systems even then. In fact, there were scoring systems back in the 1800s when the United States was moving, expanding out west. There was capital that was going to be needed to build the railroads, to build the towns, the companies that would service the people who would move to new locations as we moved out west, and they needed capital, and they needed to borrow money from banks even then. So how did the banks evaluate these customers? Well, they looked mainly at what's called qualitative variables back then. Who was the wealth of the individual, the wealth of the company, how long have they been in business, what industry are they in? Qualitative stuff, because quantitative data was simply not available. Databases certainly weren't available. Qualitative variables then became less important as financial data became more available, particularly in the beginning of the 20th century with the advent of rating agencies. Now, how many of you have heard of Moody's and Standard & Poor's? Raise your hand. Okay, only about half of you. Well, they are the two of the major rating agencies that evaluate the health of companies with respect to their probability of default on their outstanding debt obligations. And I'll get back to that in a little bit. Now, when they started in business, which was the early 20th century, they pioneered the use of financial data from companies to evaluate their health. Balance sheets, income statements, cash flow statements. How many of you had a class in accounting? Raise your hand. Okay, not enough. You need more accounting. Now, not because, I think it can be a boring subject, maybe not very exciting to you, but if you ever want to start your own business, and I think many of you will think about it, or if your parents are working in a company and they say, why don't you come work for me, or become the new CEO when I retire, you're going to have to know accounting. No doubt, even if you're not an accountant. How many of you have taken a course in corporate finance? Again, I recommend that you do so. Even if you're in science, even if you're in, because a scientist, biomedical or whatever, oftentimes starts a tech company in that area, and they have to raise money. Also, they have to pay their bills. They have to hire people. And you can't do it with any experience. Sure, you can hire other people to help you, but if you're the CEO, you're going to have to evaluate the quality of the people you hire. So I highly recommend that if you can get a course in some basic financial analysis, do it as quickly as you can. Don't wait until you're graduating and starting a company to bone up on the subject. Of course, we always think our things we teach are critical and important, but there are so many people who start companies and flounder because they may be very good scientists or they may be good in some technology subject, but they really don't know much about finance, marketing, human relations, etc. So it's important to get that kind of background, even if they don't become. Now, one thing about qualitative variables that you look at to evaluate the health of a company, it became less and less important for many years, but now it's becoming more important again because of artificial intelligence. So when you build a credit model now and you look at the health, financial health of a company or of an individual, oftentimes qualitative information about, for example, social media, something about the CEO of a company, whether or not there's a lawsuit against them, or whether or not they had some experience in some areas. What about the governance of a company? The board of directors, are there only scientists on the board, or do you have people who are experienced in other areas? And that sort of qualitative information now is becoming more and more important. It is coincident with the rise of fintechs. What is a fintech? A financial technology firm. And more we have fintechs out there growing at the same time that AI is becoming more important. And they use a lot of data that's out there that wasn't able to be harnessed before. So keep that in mind when you look about your careers going forward. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about, just 5 minutes or so, what it was like to do research in financial analysis, in bankruptcy prediction, when I did it back in the mid-1960s, and how does it compare with what's going on today? Well, so back in the early 1960s and mid-1960s, I got interested in a topic that very few people were interested in, bankruptcy. Why? Because in the 1960s, everything was revolving around growth. And most of the academics who did research in finance were looking at growth models. How do you determine how a company should grow? Or what is required in terms of growth to justify a certain stock price that the firm is selling for? So while I could have done some work in that area when I was a PhD student at UCLA, I decided to look for something that fascinated me in reading in corporate finance, but was really no longer a hot topic in the 60s what was a hot topic in the 30s and 40s, and that was distress, bankruptcy, restructurings, problems. And I must say to start with, and I'm sorry if it turns you off, I love bankruptcies. I love defaults. Because as a scientist, we need data. And the more data we have, the better we can build models to perhaps predict the event from a diagnostic and prognostic standpoint. And so, whenever there's a big bankruptcy, I get very excited and open up a bottle of fine red wine. And if there are lots of bankruptcies in a short period of time, like a week, maybe there's 2 or 3 big ones happening at the same time, my wife and I are drinking quite a bit. And in some years, like 2008, 2009, and believe it or not, last year, and even though that may surprise you, there was a huge number of bankruptcies that kind of had been under the water in terms of news. In those years, we're drunk all the time because we're just having so much fun watching the news. But from a serious standpoint, data is so important to research. Of course, there's other types of data, behavioral data and the like, that goes along with it. But I personally think that the more data we have, the better chance we have to avoid bankruptcies. And I'm going to talk about applications of these models at the end of my talk. So, back in 1966, 67, when I finished my research, and I was very fortunate to publish an article that was published in 1968 dealing with bankruptcy prediction and how we thought you can do it. I had no idea that this model, called the Z-Score model, and you can Google it and you can get all the parameters yourself very easily, Wikipedia, whatever, would still be around 50, 60 years later. Most models, whether they be finance, medical, whatever, have a very short half-life. A couple of years. Not that they're not potentially helpful, but someone will come out with a better model, a better mousetrap, so to speak. I believe that this model, which is by far the most popular model for practitioners to use, has 3 main attributes. One, it's simple. You will come away today with understanding how to apply the Z-Score model. Even if you don't know all the details, you have to do a little bit more research. 2, it's still very accurate. We think it's still accurate 80 to 90% of the time within 2 years. And I'll give you some examples. And 3, it's free. You don't have to pay for it. There are lots of models like this out there now that entrepreneurs and big firms have built to try to do the same thing. And some of them do a very good job, but they're usually very complex, so they're not simple. They're not necessarily any more accurate, but they are accurate enough. And 3, they cost a lot of money. And so, you know, it's like a cough drop. Somebody offers you a free cough drop, and you say, oh my, maybe I should try that. But they say, but you have to pay for it. You're less likely to do it than if they give it to you for free, and then you can try it whether you like it or not. So I think those are the 3 reasons that you might think about this particular model. Now let's talk about rating agencies for a moment. This chart shows you the nomenclature used by Moody's and Standard & Poor's and Fitch, the 3 largest rating agencies in the world. They're not just US agencies, they're all over the world, dealing with what's called investment grade companies and non-investment grade or junk companies. So any firm that gets a rating BBB minus or above with S&P and Fitch or Baa3 or above by Moody's is called investment grade. meaning high quality, low chance of default, and relatively safe as an investment for you, your parents, your mutual funds that you may buy, investment grade. It doesn't mean, by the way, that that company cannot go bankrupt in the future. But usually what happens before you go bankrupt, you get downgraded from investment grade to non-investment grade, or high yield, or junk. And so the bottom shaded part are what's called the high yield market. Now, I was very fortunate to be asked by a major investment bank, Morgan Stanley. Some of you may have heard of it. Many of you will hear for it when you go for jobs and you want to work on Wall Street. It's a major investment bank along with Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Merrill Lynch, etc. Well, now they're not called Merrill Lynch anymore, Bank of America, etc. Now, Morgan Stanley in 1981 asked me to give my opinion whether or not they should get involved in a new market called high yield junk bonds. How many of you have heard of junk bonds? Okay, just a few. Well, all of you now will hear about it. Now, what is a junk bond? It's a company that comes to the market, raises debt capital, but their rating is non-investment grade, low grade, or high yield, or junk. Junk is kind of a euphemism given by mainly journalists originally to represent companies that are not high quality, but somehow or other are able to raise money in the market. And this was pioneered by a firm called Drexel Burnham, and a pioneer in that, Michael Milken, who some of you may have heard of, but not. He was a very important, brilliant, but controversial entrepreneur on Wall Street. Actually, he was in Beverly Hills, who said, why not have companies which are not that high quality raise money? Of course, they have to offer investors higher yield to attract capital, and see whether or not these companies succeed or not, because otherwise their only source of capital to raise through debt markets was traditional banks, and banks have a regulatory framework that limits how much they can invest in low quality companies. And so the United States, through Drexel and many other investment banks, subsequent pioneered direct debt issues issued by non-investment grade companies. And I was very fortunate to be the first academic to look into this market when it was tiny, but potentially growing. Very important in life, you learn kind of one way or the other, not whether you're smart or not, that's helpful, but whether you're first to do something. And you're a pioneer, whether you realize it or not, when you did the research to do it. And I was very fortunate, and so we were asked by, I was asked by Morgan Stanley to give them an opinion, should they get involved in this thing called junk. You know, there's something like there's junk mail, junk foods, junk yards, junkies. It's got a negative connotation. But is a junk bond company so negative? And Morgan Stanley said, well, we don't know. We want to get our hands dirty with junk. Could you give us an opinion? I said, well, do you have data? They said, we got some data from Drexel. I said, well, I'm not going to look at Drexel's data because they are pushing this market. If you want an objective opinion, really we need to gather our own data. And the type of data we gathered was on defaults, bankruptcies, and whether or not one could predict bankruptcy, because let's face it, junk companies that raise money, or let's say high yield companies that raise money, that's the epicenter of where defaults come from, not from investment grade. Now, another topic that we don't have time to talk about today that's hugely important in today's market is called leveraged finance. What is leveraged finance? There are three types of leveraged finance. This is debt markets catering to companies that are not investment grade. High yield bonds, syndicated bank loans, and the new thing in town that's really very exciting and has grown to be the largest source of leveraged finance called private credit. Now, this won't mean much to you, but it's hugely important what's going on today in terms of the growth rate and how much money outstanding is there in private credit. Private credit are loans from non-banks, so-called shadow banks or non-bank lending. So now a company or an individual can go to a shadow bank and borrow money just like they go to a bank. And that industry has grown to the fact that it now is twice as large as the high yield bond market. And the high yield bond market is about $1.5 trillion outstanding. Bank syndicated loans about 1.4 trillion. And private credit, and here there's a lot of controversy how large, but we think is about $2.5 trillion outstanding. More than the other two. Now, one other factual point, yes?
My name is Anthony Rawson.
Andrew, a little louder though.
Yeah, senior biology major at Morehouse College. I had a quick question involving the shadow banks. So,
Yeah.
Is there a specific type of APY or APR difference when it comes to these shadow banks and like involving investing or lending and things of that nature?
APR, what do you mean APR?
Like your rates when it comes to taking loans or any type of investments that go into shadow banks at all?
Oh, shadow banks, yeah, that's a great question. Who do shadow banks lend to, mainly? Let me answer that. The main source of lending from non-bank lenders are companies owned by private equity firms. Now you may say, what's a private equity firm? Well, let me tell you how pervasive private equity is in the United States. But first, a private equity firm is an investment company that buys other companies. And they mainly do it by issuing debt from the companies they buy, and also equity that they put in. Take a guess. What percentage of US companies today are owned by private equity firms as opposed to independently owned by entrepreneurs or on the stock market and are independently owned? What percentage of companies? That's a great answer. So you maybe have seen it. I don't know if that's the correct answer, because nobody knows for sure, but it's closer to 80 than 50. Let's say 70%. And it's very controversial as whether a private equity firm owning all these companies is good or bad for our society. Let me give you a very good example. There's been a big hospital chain owned by a private equity firm that recently went bankrupt, and many of these hospitals had to close, called Stewart Health. You happen to be and by the way, this area, Connecticut, particularly Massachusetts, has been really hard hit by bankrupt hospitals owned by private equity firms who finance the purchase of these hospitals by issuing debt securities to buy out the old ownership of the hospitals or nursing homes. Now, one thing that a private equity firm does is continually borrow money. And their main source of capital is private credit, this shadow banking industry. So, how healthy the private equity industry is, and by the way, it's grown very profitably over the years, will determine, in my opinion, the health of private credit.
Question.
Yes, and
So would you state that it's a wise decision to take a loan from a shadow bank and then use that money to buy debt of these companies that end up going bankrupt?
yes, great question again. The rate of return to investors, oh, by the way, how does private credit get their money? They offer, just like any other hedge fund, they offer returns in terms of usually a minimum yield plus a share of the profits to what's called limited partners. And a limited partner could be a pension fund, an insurance company, a mutual fund, a wealthy individual. I didn't mean me, I mean a wealthy individual who can get returns, usually several percentage points higher than investing in a high yield junk bond or what a bank gets from a syndicated loan. I would guess that the average spread, the difference between the return on lending money to a private equity, or in this case, a direct private credit firm, is about 2% higher than a comparable rate that you would get if the bank made the loan. The problem is that many of these companies that borrow money from private credit cannot borrow easily from either high yield bonds or banks, and so they do it through shadow banking. There's nothing wrong with that as long as the default rate on the portfolio of loans from private equity doesn't spike too high, and then the returns will be much lower. So I'm going to talk about predicting default rates, whether it's debt owned by a private credit or a high yield bond or a bank. I wasn't even interested in private credit because I didn't know anything about it when we built the model. So here is the first generation original Z-Score model published in 1968. It's the same model I use today, but there are a number of derivative models out there. So these are 5 financial variables. So again, if you haven't had accounting or corporate finance, they may look a little foreign to you. But take it from me, these are basic measures that financial analysts, credit analysts, rating agencies, just about anybody in the financial world uses all the time and is familiar with. My innovation was, rather than look at individual measures, like a profitability measure, or a leverage measure, or a liquidity measure of a company, one at a time, we built the first multivariate model, looking at a number of factors simultaneously in order to come up with a holistic overall rating or score of a company. We called it the Z-Score or Z-Score. So these 5 variables, the first variable is a liquidity measure, working capital to assets, current assets minus current liabilities divided by assets. Second variable, retained earnings. You probably never heard of it if you've never had accounting or corporate finance. But what is retained earnings? It's the earnings of a company over its life after they pay taxes and interest, minus what dividends they pay out to their shareholders. It's reinvested money in the company, as opposed to its internal equity, as opposed to floating new stock and borrowing money externally. The more the retained earnings of a company relative to its size, usually the healthier the company. The third variable is called EBIT, earnings before interest and taxes, as a measure of profitability, divided again by assets. So it's a margin or profitability measure. The fourth variable was a variable that nobody had ever used before in the credit markets. Market value of equity to book value of debt. Think of a company or an individual, and you want to know how much debt do they have, and how leveraged are they? How vulnerable are they to having problems if they don't earn enough to pay back their debt. Well, if you look at the balance sheet, normally you look at the amount of debt and the amount of equity that the firm has. The more debt relative to equity, the more risky the company. That makes sense. But how do you measure equity? Well, two ways to measure it. How much investors have put in the company in terms of the book value of equity, or if it's publicly traded on the stock market, the market value. How much are people willing to pay for the equity relative to its debt? So we pioneered the use of market equity as a percentage compared to the amount of debt. The more market equity means that you can use higher amounts of other people's money, namely stockholders' money, to finance your operation. The lower the equity, it means that it's very difficult to raise money at a high price, and you have the problems of a firm in trouble, usually not able to issue new equity at a high price. The higher the market value of equity to book value of debt, the more solvent, the healthier the company. And finally, sales versus assets. How productive are the assets? I know this is a lot thrown at you at one time, but keep in mind that what we are looking at using fairly robust statistical analysis is multiple measures, simultaneously looking at the health of a company. Each one of those measures has a weighting or a coefficient. So I don't know if you've had courses in statistics yet. When you have a course in statistics, one of the things you will learn about, and you should not be bored by it, even though it sounds boring at first to some of you, it's called regression analysis. What is regression? It looks at how variables correlate with each other. And usually you look at one variable at a time. We argued, let's look at several variables at the same time and come up with weights as to their relative importance to explaining. And here's the issue. We decided to use as our dependent variable, the variable we're trying to explain, a binary variable, bankrupt or non-bankrupt. So we needed samples of bankrupt companies and non-bankrupt companies to build our model. And we used a technique, you probably never heard of it, but you will if you study statistics, called discriminant analysis. We're trying to discriminate between healthy firms and unhealthy firms early enough to predict whether a firm will go bankrupt or not. And these coefficients are unique to the variables we chose. So we could have chosen other variables, and then we'd have different coefficients. So this is not an optimizing model. This is a satisficing model, one that we felt had the best chance with a parsimonious selection of variables to predict an event. By the way, discriminant analysis was not discovered in finance. It was discovered in medicine. Can we look at a number of indicators of a person's health, its temperature, certain blood tests, certain skin issues, to determine the disease of the person? This is used all the time in medical science. It's called discriminant analysis in medicine. Or maybe we want to build a model to predict whether or not a firm will be purchased or not in a merger or acquisition. Or any other type of qualitative outcome that we want to predict using discriminant analysis. I don't have time to go through the algorithm with you, but when you have the chance to do research, one of the most powerful statistical techniques you can use is the association between explanatory variables and dependent variables. The explanatory variables are the ones that you can measure, get data on. The dependent variable is the variable you're trying to explain. In this case, bankruptcy or non-bankruptcy. And the Z-Score model needed an analysis back in 1968. What was the analysis? Well, you get a score. If you take those 5 variables and you multiply it by the coefficient, you will come up with a score of a company. Usually the score of a company is between +5 and -5. The higher the score, the healthier the company. The lower the score, the less healthy, and the more likely that the firm will go bankrupt. That's the theory. Now, when we built the model, we didn't have the ability to determine a probability of default. All we could say is the firm looked more like a bankrupt company or a non-bankrupt company, and how much they were more or less similar. And so we established scores and zones. Any score above 3 was a healthy firm. Any score below 1.8 was in the distress zone, and in between was, say, more ambiguous as to which they were, but clearly the higher the score, the healthier the company. And we found back in 1968 that any firm that had a score below 1.8, if you add up all those variables and multiply them by their weightings, went bankrupt within 2 years, 100% of the time. But our sample was pretty small, because back in 1968, we had no databases. So how did we get the data? We had to go to these giant manuals called Moody's Investment Manuals. You've never seen one probably, or maybe if you go to the depths of your library at your university, you'll find a Moody's Investment Manual. And in them, there were stylized balance sheets and income statements of thousands of companies. And there was a certain blue part of the book that dealt with companies that went bankrupt. So we used them, and then we took the data ourselves, myself, and we transferred the data on balance sheets and income statements onto punch cards. How many of you have ever heard of a punch card? Really? That many of you? Because nobody uses punch cards today. Maybe your parents told you about it, or you read about it somewhere. But in the old days, my days, what you did is you gathered data, and then you sat in front of a punch card machine, and you typed in the data on these 3x5 cards. And then you had one card per company. And you separated by bankrupt and non-bankrupt. You put it in a box along with the source program. The source program is either regression or discriminant or whatever it is. You picked up the box. It was pretty heavy. It was good for bodybuilding. And you walked across the campus to the mother computer. I was very fortunate to be a researcher at universities when mainframe computers first became available. Do you believe that you didn't have a computer for most social sciences back in the early and mid-1960s? It was only the IBM 360 and some of the other pioneer computers that became available to do much more rigorous, in-depth analysis on financial data. So you went to them and you submitted your job, and then you went to your favorite synagogue, mosque, or church, and you prayed. And you prayed that you got results. And half the time in my case, I got back the results. You had to wait a day that said, sorry, Eddie, one of your cards was bent a little bit, or one of your cards had a hanging shard, and we couldn't analyze the data. Go back and do it again. And that was the state of the art back then. Now you've got personal computers, you've got smartphones that can do it for you. You don't have to do anything except input the data in some form on your phone. So that was the state of the art then. There were no databases, you had to build your own, and there were very new use of computers. Today, things are much faster. So my students at NYU build models all the time, and modeling, by the way, is very important if you want to get a job on Wall Street. If you can say, I can model this or that because I had it in school and I did this and that project, you have a leg up on your competition. Very important. Wall Street loves people who can model as well as who are articulate and can communicate. So they're very important things. I don't know how much time I have, but I want to go now. I want to mention another model called Z double prime. Now you can get this PowerPoint presentation from Yale people, from Richard, if you're interested in these models, or you can read about it in Google or Wikipedia or whatever. Just look up Altman Z-Score. But there's another model called Z double prime. This is a model that's particularly good for non-manufacturing companies, like retail companies. Let me give you some examples of the difference between Z and Z double prime. The main difference is Z double prime does not use market value of equity. In other words, the firm could be a private company. Some of you probably have someone in your family who owns a company, but it's not publicly traded on the stock exchange. You can use this model for that company because we use book value of equity instead of market value in the fourth variable. There's only 4 variables here, again, a different set of coefficients. So let me give you some examples. I don't know if you've ever heard of a big chain of retail stores called Sears Roebuck. It was the largest retail company in the world in some years, bigger than Walmart or whatever at the time. And it went bankrupt in 2018. And if you look at the bond rating equivalent of the Z-scores, which is in our data, you can see that the Z double prime score model predicted bankruptcy. D, by the way, is the designation of a defaulted firm from Moody's and Standard & Poor's. Whenever a firm goes bankrupt or defaults in some other way, it gets a D rating. And a score below 0 from either Z or Z double prime is indicative of a prediction of going bankrupt. So keep that in mind if you ever want to apply the model. Anyway, 2 years before Sears Roebuck went bankrupt, the Z-score model was predicting it, Z double prime, whereas the Z model was not. It was saying it was more healthy. Here's another one. Rite Aid, you know the pharmacy called Rite Aid? Well, they went bankrupt in 2024, and notice that the model, from a time series standpoint, showed a big deterioration, particularly the Z double prime. The other model was pretty stable, and predicted bankruptcy for the first time in 2023. It went bankrupt in 2024. And finally, another retail company that you may have heard of called Walgreens. How many of you have heard of Walgreens? Yeah, most of you have. Well, Walgreens actually is 3 companies. In the UK, it's called Boots. So if any of you are from the UK and maybe some other countries, Boots Alliance. It's a third company, I forget what it is. There are 3 companies that are all part of the Walgreens parent company. Well, Walgreens did not go bankrupt, but Walgreens was deteriorating. Everyone knew it. It had more than $100 billion in market value 2 years ago. It was bought by a private equity firm this year, maybe 2 months ago, for $10 billion. Now, why would a company like KKR and Apollo, these are some of the giant private equity firms. Again, private equity firms, gentleman who said about 80% of the companies are owned by private equity firms. I'm talking about public and private. You ever hear something called a leverage buyout? Well, a leverage buyout is where a private equity firm buys out a publicly owned company by offering a premium to the stockholders of the current, over the current price, and finances it using leverage or debt for the most part. So why would a private equity firm buy a company that if they looked up on Bloomberg and they saw the Z-Score was deep in the bankruptcy zone, why would they ever buy a company that we thought was likely to go bankrupt, which we did in 2024? And the answer is, these private equity firms also have a distressed division, and their job is to find companies that are undervalued, they think, and can be turned around. So there's a whole new field that a lot of my students at NYU are really turned on by called turnaround management. Mainly consulting firms that help firms turn around. Or it's called corporate restructuring. And restructuring now is hugely important to my undergraduates at Stern. Why? We have a new group called SSIG, and those are undergraduates who are interested in getting a career in turnaround management or distressed investing. And we had 450 students sign up for this group this past year. It's a new initiative at Stern, and our job is to find jobs for these students when they graduate. And it's called the Altman Initiative. John Paulson, you may have heard of The Big Short. This was a company that made tons of money during the financial crisis of 08, 09. The point I want to make is, we think that Walgreens would have gone bankrupt. Not necessarily go out of business. By the way, in bankruptcy, there are two main types of bankruptcy: liquidation or reorganization. And now, I don't know how much time I have, Richard, but I should get to the applications, and we can talk about this area called reorganization. Chapter 11, it's called. So if any of you get turned on by credit, one aspect of credit is companies go bankrupt all the time. Last year, more than 7,000 US companies filed for bankruptcy under Chapter 11. What does that mean? They file for bankruptcy for protection from the bankruptcy code to give them time to restructure, to emerge as a healthier going concern. That's restructuring and reorganization, the theory of Chapter 11. Sometimes it doesn't work. Many companies try to restructure, they can't do it, profits deteriorate further, nobody wants to buy them. So Walgreens, in my opinion, would have gone bankrupt probably within 12 months, and then would have filed for bankruptcy to try to restructure, to get rid of debt, cut costs, and hopefully turn itself around. The private equity firms that bought Walgreens said, I can do it better than the bankruptcy code, and all I have to pay is $10 billion now, and we think the company could be worth $50 billion in a couple of years. We'll see if it works, because sometimes it doesn't, and they have to go bankrupt. So that's Chapter 11, restructuring. And there are firms that specialize in advising companies how to either avoid bankruptcy, or if you're in bankruptcy, how to restructure. And they are big firms. I'm not talking about tiny firms. The biggest two firms are Alvarez and Marsal, has about 5,000 employees globally, and Alex Partners has about 3,000. And every year, some of my students go to these firms, whether they be MBA students and increasingly undergraduates. So, let's talk about applications and then see if there are any questions. Oh, one last question that you probably never thought about, you don't care about, but it's good conversation when you have a glass of wine tonight. And that is, we talked about credit ratings, bond ratings. The highest bond rating possible is called AAA. God, they're beautiful. You know, they've got low debt, they've got high profits. The probability of bankruptcy is probably less than 1% over the next 10 years. How many AAA companies were there in the United States? I know you don't know the answer to this, but anyway, it's a rhetorical question somewhat, but maybe interesting. In the United States in 1990, and how many are there today? AAA companies. And who are they, by the way? So take a guess. Where's the gentleman who got the 80% right? He's raising his hand too. I didn't plant him in the audience. But he's right. There are only two. Who are they? Microsoft and Johnson & Johnson. And soon Johnson & Johnson will no longer be AAA. They'll be downgraded. You know what we call a company that's downgraded from whatever rating they are, but their investment grade, maybe downgraded to junk? So you can go from triple B to double B. Fallen angels. A fallen angel is somebody who's beautiful at birth, very handsome, cuddly little baby, pink cheeks and whatever. But as they get older, like all of us, we get uglier. We develop wrinkles. We lose our hair. And we get downgraded from investment grade to junk. That's a fallen angel. This is not a fallen angel. This is AAA, maybe downgraded to AA. Two left. How many were there in 1990? That you don't know. I don't even know how you knew the first one. Well, let's take a look. 99. Why were there almost 100 companies that were AAA in 1990 and only 2 today? Are they all less profitable? Well, many of them are, but many of them are still very profitable. But they're no longer AAA. What has happened over the last 30 plus years?
Businesses are buying out businesses.
Well, that's part of it too, yes. They become, but what happens when they get bought out? They get financed with debt. So the amount of debt in the financial system today is hugely more than it was in 1990. And most of these companies that have been downgraded from AAA to below that have not done it because they're less profitable, although some are. They've done it because they've added debt to their balance sheet. Now, debt could be fantastic. Think about what it costs to borrow money when you're AAA. Maybe today, 4.5%. The risk-free rate is the government rate, not so much risk-free anymore. The U.S. government could be downgraded again within a very short period of time. And they were downgraded once by Standard & Poor's from AAA. We're no longer AAA country. We're AA+. That's the next level down. And we could be downgraded again pretty soon because of the tariffs that have been included. So downgrading, and what, by the way, when the U.S. government gets downgraded, what happens to its cost of capital? Goes up. So the interest rate that we have to pay on our government debt will go up, even if interest rates don't go up in general, because we are lower quality. By the way, how much interest do you think the U.S. government pays every day on its government debt? Take a guess. How much every day? Every day, $3 billion. Almost $1 trillion in cost to the U.S. government to finance its $36 trillion of debt. And it's going to rise under, no matter who's president. You have the president saying, we want to cut costs, and we want to lay off all those people and cut things. That's trivial compared to if they could, again, be AAA, the amount of savings that way. But maybe they're trying to do that as well. The point I want to make is that leverage in the system has increased dramatically, particularly corporate and government debt. So let's talk about now applications, and I'll just give you two quick ones and then take questions. So I'm skipping over a lot of stuff, and I'm getting to applications of our model. Incidentally, the Z-Score model is available. You probably never heard of this, but maybe some of you have, but you will hear of it if you're interested in finance going forward. It's called Bloomberg Terminals. So many of you have heard of Michael Bloomberg. You may have heard of a thing called Bloomberg machines. These are terminals that all financial analysts usually have access to, and on it you get financial data on all sorts of things, and economic data. And one of the things you can get on Bloomberg is the Z-Score. You don't even have to calculate it yourself. Just put in the ticker symbol for the company, and you hit AZS-Go, Altman Z-Score Go. And you get it for free, and you get it instantaneously, or you can calculate it yourself. It'll take you about 30 minutes. And Mr. Bloomberg tells me that the Z-Score gets about 5,000 hits a day. And I don't get 1 penny per hit. Unfortunately, I can get a couple of nice meals in Manhattan for each day from if I got 1 penny per hit. But I don't care. It's in the public domain. What I'm interested in, do people find it of use to them in their analysis of debt or equity securities, or indeed of governments or companies in general? So let me talk about two applications. This chart, if you're interested, it shows you two types of applications. Left-hand side, these are applications for users who are external to the firm. So an investigative reporter is external to the firm. He can use Z-Score on companies if they're interested in. The right-hand side are generally internal, within the firm, uses of Z-Score. And on the right-hand side, let me concentrate on two applications. One on the right, to file or not to file. William Shakespeare said that for the first time, a couple hundred years ago. Just kidding. But to file or not to file, meaning the company has to decide at some point if they are distressed, should they file for bankruptcy or not? Who, by the way, and who only can make that decision for a company? The board of directors. Outside people cannot make a decision. And indeed, managers, yes, they can follow through, but the board must vote for a Chapter 11 corporate bankruptcy. So this application I'm going to talk about had to do with an American icon company called General Motors. You've all heard of General Motors. Some of you either own or your parents own a General Motors car. Well, General Motors was in financial distress, big time, in 2008. In fact, they were deteriorating dramatically along with the rest of the U.S. automobile industry, probably starting in the early 2000s. And I started looking at GM and Ford and Chrysler around 2005, when they were rated BBB, investment grade. In 2008, on December 2nd, I received a phone call from the ranking member of the House of Representatives Finance Committee, asking would I be willing to testify before the Finance Committee whether or not the government should bail out General Motors. This was December 2nd, 2008. We were just starting the great financial crisis. None of you in this audience lived through the great financial crisis when you were aware of it, but your parents were. And it was a horrible financial period. It wasn't as serious as the Great Depression, but interest rates, believe it or not, on corporate debt in general increased to 20% above the risk-free rate. And no company can survive on that for a very long period of time. So there was no trading going on in credit in 2008. Fortunately, we recovered somewhat, or quite a bit, starting in late 2009. But this is late 2008. Should the US government bail out a private company? It happened to be the largest automobile company in the United States, and it used to be the largest automobile company in the world. It was surpassed by Toyota in about 2006 or 7. So, I was asked to testify, so I said, when do you want me to testify? They said, Friday. And this was Monday. I said, oh, that doesn't give me much time. So I called up my graduate assistant. His name was Avi Gupta. And I said, Avi, do me a favor, run the latest Z-Score on GM. I want to know how sick, I knew they were in trouble. I want to know just how sick they look according to an objective, unbiased model. It has a human element. I built the model, but there's no human saying that score is too high or too low. It's what the data has shown in the past. He ran the model, it looked very sick. And so the panel, there were two panels before the House Finance Committee. Have you heard of a regulation called Dodd-Frank? Not many. Well, Dodd-Frank was a regulation that came out of the great financial crisis, and it had to do with financial reporting, pension funds, and the like. Much more prudent, had to have more reporting, and the chief financial officer and the CEO of the company must sign off on the financial statements as being true and accurate data, among other things. Anyway, the chairman of this committee was Mr. Frank, and he was a congressman from Massachusetts, well known at the time. And so there were two panels. The CEOs of GM, Ford, and Chrysler, as well as the head of the automobile unions, were testifying as to why they should be bailed out and what would they do with the money. And the second panel were, quote, experts, mainly practitioners and a few academics like myself, as to whether or not the government should do it or not, and why they should or shouldn't. So I got up. You have 5 minutes. By the way, this is the way it works. You got to write a testimony. It could be 1,000 pages, 10 pages, submit it to the Congress, and you've got 5 minutes to articulate what you conclude. And then there's Q&A coming from the congressman. And the Finance Committee had about 75 congressmen on it. It was the largest committee in the House. So I was the only one who argued GM should not be bailed out, should go bankrupt, and get incredible protection while they restructure. And by the way, they should get $50 billion in new loans called debtor in possession lending. And by the way, you don't have to know all this very much, but a debtor in possession loan is a new creditor. We're running out of time. But you said midnight. I'm just kidding. Okay, I want to finish the story. The debtor in possession loan gives a super priority to the new creditor over the old creditors. It's very important. And so we applied the Z-Score model. And the Z-Score in 2008 was -0.35, deep into the bankruptcy zone. I was convinced that they were headed for bankruptcy. Question is, if they got bailed out with 10 or 15 billion dollars in new loans, would they survive? And I argue they're going to go bankrupt anyway. And they need 50 billion in new lending, probably from the government, but maybe it could be from some other company in the line. Well, I didn't exactly get booed by the Congress, but they didn't like me. My wife was in the audience. This is all on YouTube, by the way, if you want to watch it. My wife was in the audience, and she said, no, you did okay, you did good. And I got a lot of fan mail and some hate mail, too, afterwards, because the Congress people didn't understand bankruptcy. They thought bankruptcy meant basically liquidation. And I'm saying, no, it means reorganization, and this is the way to do it. Cut costs, get rid of debt, swap debt for equity, and get new loans to give you working capital while you're restructuring. They didn't want to hear the B word. So the House voted to bail out GM. The Senate, for conservative reasons, said, no, we don't want to bail out a private company. And George Bush, who was president at the time, in the last thing he did, had an executive order, you've heard of executive orders, that said, we will bail out GM and Chrysler, not Ford, for $15 billion and $10 billion respectively. GM 15, and I think 10, but I'm not sure about Chrysler. And now it's Obama's problem. Because Obama was coming into office 20 days later, 2 months later. And I said, oh, this is a mistake. But anyway, what happened was they tried to restructure, not out of the bankruptcy, but with a $15 billion bailout, GM, and a little less for Chrysler. They did not succeed, and on June 1st, 2009, 6 months later, GM went bankrupt. It was probably the happiest day in my professional life. I was drunk for a week. Seriously. Because I felt this is what's going to save GM. And they got $50 billion in debtor in possession loan from the government, which was paid off 100% plus interest in 1 year. And notice what happened to the Z-Score. It went up, not terrifically. By the way, I don't think GM is a terribly healthy company today, but it's much healthier, as you could see, than it was in 2008. A lot has to do with China, a lot has to do with electric cars, and a lot of other things going on now. The point I want to make is that we use an academically developed model to determine what we think would happen to this company, even with the $15 billion bailout, and articulated that in terms of a prediction and a recommendation that the company should go bankrupt. One last thing I want to mention, and then I don't know, maybe we can talk about it at lunch or whatever, maybe take 1 or 2 questions, is another great application of these models is something I never thought of until I heard about it, that it was used by the CEO of a technology company in around 1985, a long time ago. And that is to reverse engineer the model with a company. So the model predicts, say the Z-score is 0 or below, that the company will go bankrupt within 2 years, which is basically the usual type of evaluation. The CEO who knew this said, what do I have to do to raise my Z-score? How do I get into the safe zone as opposed to the bankrupt zone? And the company did it. The name of the company was GTI Corporation, was publicly owned at the time, was sold to a Scandinavian technology company. They manufacture high-tech products for the aerospace, automobile, and computer industries. Company went from a negative score to a positive 9, which is terrific. Sold out the company at a high rate. The point I want to make is he used the model not to predict bankruptcy only, but to use it as a turnaround strategy. What do I have to do so the model will say, I will not go bankrupt? So with that, I'll conclude. There's lots more to talk about. Thank you. Sorry to keep you waiting so long. Oh, 7:30. We got till 5 o'clock.
One more round of applause.
I'll be around at lunch. I'm sorry I took so much time. I know you may have questions, so you may want to munch with me, and then we'll chat a little bit, as well as the prior speaker. You'll be here as well.
All right, just one quick announcement before we get going. So, pizza is going to be out upstairs. We have it from Sally's with Pizza. It's one of New Haven's famous, probably the best pizza in New Haven. And maybe just a little bit better than New York. But, so, we're going to do a little bit of a quick turnaround here. Your posters have been set up for you in Payne Whitney Gymnasium. They are there, they are waiting for you. The judges are starting to arrive. Once you do lunch, we're going to ask you that you just make your way as quickly as you can. You can stop for a few questions, for a few photos, but really like hard deadline when we're going to start sending judges around is probably closer to 2:15, okay? So keep that in mind. It's a bit of a walk. If you have any questions with directions, our staff is here. Go eat some pizza.